At a glamorous business dinner, a wealthy husband publicly humiliated his wife, flaunting his younger mistress while dismissing her worth in front of powerful executives. But what no one saw coming was the woman's quiet resilience, and how that night would mark the beginning of something far greater. The sound of ice clinking against glass echoed through the lavish penthouse as Sophie Chambers adjusted her emerald silk dress in the mirror, the fabric cascading over her figure like a river of precious stone. The dress was a statement, classy, bold, and unmistakably elegant, much like the woman who wore it. She had chosen it carefully, hoping it would remind her husband, Richard, of the woman he had once adored. But the flicker of hope that had briefly sparked inside her faded as quickly as it had come. Richard wasn't the man he used to be, and tonight, she would face the cruel reality of just how far they had drifted apart. The penthouse itself, perched above the glittering skyline of New York City, was a masterpiece of modern architecture. Floor-to-ceiling windows, Italian marble floors, and designer furniture that seemed too expensive to sit on. But for all its grandeur, the space felt cold, devoid of the warmth that Sophie had tried so desperately to create. It was ironic, she thought. They had built a life of luxury but had forgotten how to live in it. "Richard, are you ready?" she called from the bedroom, glancing at the clock on the wall. The business dinner was set to begin in less than an hour, and as usual, Richard was running late. She smoothed down the fabric of her dress, her fingers trembling slightly as she heard his footsteps approaching. When he entered the room, Sophie couldn't help but feel the familiar pang of disappointment. Richard Chambers was the epitome of wealth and power, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with impeccably styled salt and pepper hair and a designer suit tailored to perfection. But the warmth that once softened his sharp features had been replaced by an air of indifference, as if the world owed him everything, and he owed it nothing. "You look nice," he said, barely glancing at her before checking his phone. His tone was flat, the compliment more of an obligation than a genuine remark. Sophie forced a smile. "Thanks. Are we driving together?" Richard hesitated, then pocketed his phone. "Actually, no. I'm picking up someone on the way. You can take the car." Her heart sank, but she quickly masked the hurt with a nod. "Okay. Who are you picking up?" He shrugged, as if the answer were irrelevant. "Amber." The name hit her like a slap across the face, but she kept her expression neutral. Amber, the woman Richard had been parading around as if she were a trophy. Sophie had heard the whispers at previous events, seen the glances of pity from acquaintances who knew exactly what was going on but were too polite to say anything. And now, Richard wasn't even bothering to hide it. "You're bringing her to the dinner?" Sophie asked, her voice steadier than she expected. "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "It's important. She's good with the investors." Good with the investors. Sophie bit the inside of her cheek to keep from saying something she would regret. Amber was 27, a former model-turned-business consultant, with long blonde hair, legs that seemed to go on forever, and a dazzling smile that could disarm even the most hardened businessman. Sophie knew exactly what kind of impression she made on Richard's associates, but it didn't make the situation any easier to stomach. "I see," she said, turning back to the mirror to fix her earrings. Her reflection stared back at her, a mixture of sadness and resolve etched into her features. "You'll be fine," Richard added, as if that was supposed to be comforting. "Just mingle, make small talk. You're good at that." The dismissal stung, but Sophie remained silent. She had spent years perfecting the role of the supportive wife, charming, graceful, and never demanding too much. But tonight, something inside her felt different. There was a crack in the facade she had built, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold it together. The car ride to the hotel was a blur of city lights and swirling thoughts. Sophie stared out the window, her mind replaying the countless nights she had spent waiting for Richard to come home, only to be met with excuses and half-hearted apologies. She had given up her career, her dreams, to support his ambitions. And now, he couldn't even give her the courtesy of respect. When she arrived at the hotel, the grand entrance was teeming with wealthy socialites and business moguls, all dressed in designer outfits that sparkled under the crystal chandeliers. The ballroom was a spectacle of opulence, with golden accents, towering floral arrangements, and waiters gliding through the crowd with trays of champagne. Sophie stepped inside, the hum of conversation washing over her like a wave. As she made her way through the crowd, she spotted Richard near the bar, laughing with a group of executives. Amber was draped on his arm, her laughter high-pitched and flirtatious. Sophie's stomach churned, but she forced herself to keep walking, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. "Sophie, over here." A familiar voice called out, and she turned to see Daniel, an old family friend and one of the few people she trusted. He greeted her with a warm smile and a glass of champagne. "You look stunning tonight." "Thank you," she replied, accepting the glass. "How have you been?" They chatted for a few minutes, but Sophie's attention kept drifting back to Richard and Amber. She watched as Richard introduced Amber to the CEO of a major tech company, his hand resting possessively on her waist. The sight made Sophie's chest tighten, but she refused to let it show. "Excuse me," she said to Daniel, placing the glass on a nearby table. "I need some fresh air." She stepped out onto the terrace, the cool evening breeze a welcome relief from the suffocating atmosphere inside. The city stretched out before her, a sea of lights and possibilities. For a moment, she closed her eyes, letting the wind caress her face. This was her breaking point. She couldn't go on like this, living in the shadow of a man who didn't see her, didn't value her. As she opened her eyes, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see Richard standing there, his expression a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. "What are you doing out here?" he asked. "Thinking," she replied simply. "About what?" Sophie met his gaze, her heart pounding. "About how much longer I can keep doing this." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Doing what?" "Pretending that everything is fine," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "Pretending that you haven't humiliated me, that you haven't replaced me." His expression hardened. "Don't be dramatic, Sophie. You know how important tonight is." "I do," she said, stepping closer. "But do you?" Before he could respond, she turned and walked back inside, leaving him standing on the terrace. She didn't need his approval or his apologies anymore. Tonight, she would begin reclaiming the woman she had lost, the woman who wasn't defined by her husband's success or his betrayal. As she re-entered the ballroom, a spark of determination ignited within her. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. What would you do if someone you trusted humiliated you like Richard did to Sophie? Would you fight back or walk away? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more inspiring stories like this. The door to the penthouse closed with a soft click, but the sound reverberated through Sophie's chest like a gunshot. She dropped her clutch onto the marble countertop in the kitchen, her legs trembling beneath her. The silence that greeted her was deafening, amplifying the echoes of Amber's laughter and the smug tone in Richard's voice as he introduced her to his colleagues. She exhaled shakily, leaning against the cool countertop for support. Everything about tonight had been a humiliation, a public unraveling of a life she had worked so hard to maintain. For years, she had buried her frustrations beneath a polished smile and a patient demeanor, hoping that things would eventually fall back into place. But Richard's blatant disregard for her tonight had shattered any illusions she had left. Sophie slipped off her heels and padded softly across the living room, the plush rug cushioning her steps. She passed the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the shimmering lights of New York City, a view that once made her feel like anything was possible. Tonight, it felt like the city was mocking her. Her reflection in the glass caught her attention, and she stopped, studying the woman who stared back. The makeup she had meticulously applied earlier that evening had smudged slightly around her eyes, giving her the appearance of someone who had been crying, even though she hadn't shed a single tear. Her emerald dress still fit her perfectly, hugging her curves and accentuating her elegance, but it no longer felt like armor. It felt like a costume, something she had put on to pretend she belonged in a world where she was now a stranger. Sophie pressed her hand against the glass, the cold surface grounding her. Memories flooded her mind. The day Richard proposed to her on the rooftop of their first apartment, the way he used to bring her coffee in bed on Sunday mornings, the nights they stayed up late dreaming about their future. Those memories felt like they belonged to another lifetime. She sank onto the couch, pulling a throw blanket over her lap. The plush fabric was comforting, but it couldn't shield her from the storm raging inside. Her mind raced through the events of the evening, each moment like a dagger piercing her heart. The looks of pity from the other wives, the way Amber had clung to Richard's arm, and worst of all, the conversation she had overheard when she accidentally stepped into the wrong corridor. Richard, laughing with one of his business partners, had said it so casually, "Sophie's good at charity work, but she's not cut out for the real world. I mean, she couldn't handle the pressure if she tried." Amber, on the other hand, now, she's got potential. The words had struck Sophie like a physical blow, leaving her breathless and paralyzed. She had stood there, hidden behind a marble pillar, listening as her husband belittled her ambitions and praised his mistress as if she were the future of his empire. When the conversation ended, she had slipped back into the ballroom, masking her devastation with a polite smile. But here, in the privacy of her home, she didn't have to pretend anymore. The tears she had been holding back finally spilled over, streaming down her cheeks as sobs racked her body. The sound filled the empty room, but there was no one to hear her, no one to offer comfort or reassurance. After what felt like an eternity, Sophie wiped her tears with the sleeve of her dress and took a deep breath. She couldn't stay like this, broken, defeated, and waiting for someone else to pick up the pieces. Her gaze drifted to the bookshelf in the corner of the room, where a row of leather-bound journals sat neatly arranged. She had always been a meticulous planner, documenting every major life event, goal, and dream in those journals. She stood up, her legs still wobbly, and walked over to the bookshelf. Her fingers grazed the spines of the journals until she found the one she was looking for. A navy blue leather notebook with gold lettering on the cover. She pulled it out and carried it back to the couch, flipping through the pages until she reached a section labeled Dream Ventures. The words stared back at her like a reminder of the woman she had once been. Before she became Mrs. Richard Chambers, she had been Sophie Whitman, a rising star in the world of marketing with a reputation for creativity and innovation. She had been ambitious, driven, and determined to make a name for herself. But when Richard's career took off, she had willingly stepped back, believing that supporting his success was just as important as pursuing her own. Her eyes scanned the notes she had written years ago, ideas for startups, marketing strategies, and a proposal for an eco-friendly product line that she had pitched to a small investor before abandoning it entirely. Her breath hitched as she remembered how excited she had been about the idea, how confident she had felt before life intervened and swept her down a different path. A soft knock on the door jolted her from her thoughts. She quickly closed the notebook and set it aside, wiping her face before opening the door. Julia, her best friend since college, stood there with a bottle of wine in one hand and a concerned expression on her face. "I saw the pictures from tonight," Julia said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "You didn't look happy." Sophie managed a weak smile. "You could say that." Julia set the wine bottle on the kitchen counter and pulled Sophie into a hug. "I was worried about you." "I'm fine," Sophie lied, her voice cracking slightly. "No, you're not." Julia pulled back, studying her friend's face. "But that's okay. You don't have to be." Sophie's shoulders sagged as the weight of the evening pressed down on her once again. "I feel so stupid," she admitted. "I let him humiliate me in front of everyone. And the worst part is, I didn't even say anything. I just stood there and let it happen." Julia's grip on her shoulders tightened. "Listen to me, Sophie. You are not stupid. You trusted him, and he betrayed that trust. That's on him, not you." Sophie nodded, tears welling in her eyes again. "He said I'd never succeed on my own, that I couldn't handle the pressure." Julia's eyes flashed with anger. "That's bullshit, and you know it. You were one of the most talented marketing executives in the city before you put your career on hold for him. You built his image, his brand. You've always been capable. You just need to remember that." The words resonated deep within Sophie, igniting a spark of something she hadn't felt in years: determination. She thought of the notebook on the couch, the dreams she had tucked away for safekeeping, and the proposal that had once filled her with excitement. Maybe Julia was right. Maybe it wasn't too late to reclaim what she had lost. "What if I tried again?" Sophie asked hesitantly. Julia's face lit up. Then you'd prove him wrong. The idea took root in Sophie's mind, growing stronger with each passing moment. She didn't need Richard's approval or validation. She had her own vision, her own talents, and the courage to start over. For the first time that night, a genuine smile crossed her lips. "I think I'm ready," she said softly. Julia raised the bottle of wine. "Then let's celebrate the beginning of your comeback." As they poured the wine and toasted to new beginnings, Sophie felt a renewed sense of purpose coursing through her veins. Richard had tried to break her, but he had only awakened a part of her that she had forgotten existed. And this time, she wouldn't let anyone dim her light. Tonight had been her breaking point, but tomorrow would be her turning point. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and the low hum of chatter filled the small cafe where Sophie Chambers sat by the window, her fingers tracing the edge of her ceramic mug. Sunlight filtered through the glass, casting warm patterns on the rustic wooden table in front of her. The cafe was a stark contrast to the cold, modern world of penthouse apartments and corporate dinners that had defined her life for the past decade. Here, there was no pretense, just warmth and comfort. She had chosen this spot deliberately, hoping it would bring clarity to the whirlwind of thoughts swirling in her mind. On the table sat her navy blue notebook, its pages filled with notes from the past 2 days of sleepless nights. Sophie had stayed up long after the city had gone quiet, poring over her old ideas, updating them with the knowledge and experience she had gained over the years. The more she wrote, the more the fire inside her grew. This wasn't just about proving Richard wrong. It was about reclaiming the version of herself she had lost, the woman who had once believed she could conquer anything. A voice snapped her out of her thoughts. "Sophie." She looked up to see Marcus Whitmore standing near the table, a look of pleasant surprise on his face. Marcus had been one of her closest colleagues during her early years in marketing, back when they both worked at a small but promising agency. He was a tall man in his mid-30s, with warm brown eyes and an easy smile that hadn't changed a bit since the last time she saw him. "Marcus," she said, standing up to hug him. "It's been forever." He laughed, stepping back to get a better look at her. "You look exactly the same. Well, maybe a bit more sophisticated. The city suits you." Sophie gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit. I can't believe we ran into each other." Marcus slid into the seat, setting his laptop bag on the floor. "It's fate," he said, grinning. "What brings you here?" Sophie hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much she wanted to reveal. But Marcus had always been someone she trusted, and if there was anyone who could understand what she was going through, it was him. "Actually, I'm working on something," she admitted, tapping the notebook with her fingers. "Something big." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You've got my attention." Sophie took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before explaining. "I had this idea a few years ago, a startup focused on eco-friendly, AI-powered home systems. Back then, it was just a concept, but now, I think it could really work. People are more interested in sustainable living, and with the advancements in smart home technology, the timing feels right." Marcus leaned forward, his interest piqued. "That sounds promising. What's the unique angle?" "It's not just about smart thermostats or lighting systems," Sophie said, her passion evident in her voice. "I want to create a fully integrated system that learns from the homeowner's habits to optimize energy consumption, reduce waste, and improve overall efficiency. Think of it as a personal sustainability assistant for your home." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "And you have a plan to make this happen?" "I'm working on it," Sophie replied. "I've been updating my old proposal, but I need guidance. The industry has evolved since I left, and I don't want to make rookie mistakes." Marcus smiled. "You're not a rookie, Sophie. You've got more experience than most people who jump into startups. But you're right, it's a different landscape now. The good news is, I can help with that. I'm still connected with a lot of people in tech and venture capital. If you're serious about this, I can introduce you to some key players." Sophie's heart raced with excitement. "Really? You do that?" "Of course," Marcus said. "But first, I need to see your pitch. Investors won't just hand you money based on a good idea. They need to see potential for growth, a clear business model, and a solid team." Sophie nodded, her mind already racing with ideas. "I can have a draft ready by the end of the week." "Perfect," Marcus said. pulling out his phone. I'll set up a preliminary meeting with an angel investor I know. He's a bit tough to impress, but if you can get him on board, you'll be in a good position. As they exchanged contact information, Sophie felt a surge of hope. For the first time in a long while, she had a concrete plan. A path forward that didn't involve being defined by Richard or his world. This was hers, and she was ready to fight for it. That night, Sophie sat at the large oak desk in her home office, surrounded by papers, sticky notes, and her laptop. The soft glow of the desk lamp illuminated her face as she typed furiously, refining every aspect of her business plan. She worked through the night, fueled by determination and several cups of coffee. The doubts that had plagued her earlier were still there, lurking in the corners of her mind, but they no longer held her back. She knew the stakes were high, but that only made her more determined to succeed. By dawn, the first draft of her pitch was complete. She leaned back in her chair, stretching her arms above her head as she surveyed the organized chaos around her. Her notebook was filled with sketches of product designs, market analysis, and financial projections. The presentation slides on her laptop detailed the problem her startup aimed to solve and the innovative solution it offered. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. A knock on the door startled her, and she turned to see Julia peeking inside, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Thought you could use a refill," Julia said, walking in and handing her a mug. "You're a lifesaver," Sophie said, taking a sip. The warmth of the coffee spread through her, reviving her after the long night. Julia sat on the edge of the desk, glancing at the papers. "You've been busy." "I couldn't stop," Sophie admitted. "Once I started, the ideas just kept flowing." "That's a good sign," Julia said, smiling. "How do you feel about the pitch?" "Nervous," Sophie confessed. "I haven't done anything like this in years. What if I freeze up? What if they ask questions I can't answer?" Julia placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're going to do great. You know this stuff better than anyone. And even if you stumble, that doesn't mean you've failed. It just means you're human." Sophie exhaled, grateful for her friend's support. "Thanks, Julia. I needed that." "Anytime," Julia said. "Now, what's the next step?" "I'm meeting with an investor next week," Sophie replied. "Marcus is helping me set it up. If the meeting goes well, I'll be one step closer to getting the funding I need." Julia grinned. "Then we'll celebrate when you close the deal. But until then, you need rest. You've been running on fumes." Sophie nodded, closing her laptop. "You're right. I should get some sleep." As she crawled into bed, her mind buzzed with anticipation. The meeting next week could be a turning point, an opportunity to prove to herself and to the world that she was capable of building something extraordinary. Richard's words still lingered in the back of her mind, but they no longer had the power to paralyze her. Instead, they fueled her determination. Before drifting off to sleep, Sophie whispered to herself, "You can do this." Because for the first time in years, she truly believed she could. The rain tapped softly against the large windows of the co-working space, blurring the view of the bustling city beyond. Inside, Sophie sat at a long oak table, her laptop open, and papers scattered around her like the remnants of a brainstorming storm. The hum of conversations from nearby entrepreneurs filled the air, creating a sense of shared ambition that was both comforting and invigorating. This was where ideas were born and turned into something real, a place where failure was just a step on the path to success. She glanced down at her phone, checking the time. The meeting with her newly assembled team was set to begin in 15 minutes, and though she had meticulously prepared for this moment, her heart pounded with nerves. It had been years since she had taken charge of anything outside her charity work, and even that paled in comparison to leading a startup from scratch. The team wasn't large, just 3 other people for now, but they were passionate and skilled. Marcus had helped her recruit them, Priya, a brilliant software developer with a background in artificial intelligence, Jacob, a product designer who had worked on several successful tech projects, and Elena, a marketing strategist known for her creative campaigns. They weren't the biggest or most experienced team, but they were exactly what Sophie needed, people who believed in her vision. One by one, they filed into the conference room, bringing their laptops and notebooks. Priya, a petite woman with curly hair and glasses, greeted Sophie with a warm smile. "Excited to get started," she said, setting her coffee down. Me too, Sophie replied, her nerves easing slightly. Jacob, a tall man with a laid-back demeanor and a sketchbook always in hand, plopped into the seat next to Priya. I've been thinking about the interface design, he said, flipping through his sketches. I want it to be intuitive, but we should also make sure it has a wow factor. Elena arrived last, her energy filling the room as she dropped her bag onto the table. Sorry, traffic was crazy, she said, then immediately pulled out her laptop. I've been working on the brand identity. I have some ideas for the name. Sophie nodded, feeling the buzz of creativity around her. Let's dive in, she said, pulling up the presentation on her laptop. The screen lit up with the first slide, Econist, Smart Sustainable Living. As you all know, Econist is more than just a smart home system, Sophie began, her voice steadying as she spoke. We're creating a product that helps people live sustainably without compromising on convenience. Our AI system will learn from user behavior and adjust energy consumption automatically, reducing waste while maximizing comfort. The team listened intently, nodding as Sophie walked them through the details of the product. She highlighted the key features: an adaptive energy management system, water conservation technology, and a user-friendly app that provided real-time feedback on environmental impact. The more she spoke, the more her confidence grew. This was her idea, her vision, and for the first time in years, she felt fully in control. Priya leaned forward, her eyes lighting up. I've been thinking about how we can make the AI smarter over time. If we implement machine learning algorithms that adapt based on seasonal changes, we could optimize energy usage even further. That's exactly what we need, Sophie said, making a note on her tablet. Jacob, how are we looking on the product design side? Jacob flipped open his sketchbook, revealing several rough drafts of the system's interface. I've kept the design clean and modern, but I want it to feel warm and inviting. A lot of smart home tech feels cold and impersonal, but I think we can differentiate ourselves by making Econist feel like an extension of the home. Sophie smiled. I love it. Let's keep that warmth in mind as we move forward. Elena chimed in, scrolling through her laptop. I've been playing around with some taglines. What do you think of intelligence that cares or where smart meets sustainable? Both are strong, Sophie replied. We can test them later with focus groups. As the meeting progressed, the team bounced ideas off one another, refining the product's features and brainstorming marketing strategies. Sophie watched them with a sense of pride. This wasn't just a team. They were collaborators, innovators, and believers in her dream. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she belonged. After nearly 2 hours of discussion, they wrapped up the meeting with a list of action items and deadlines. Priya and Jacob left first, but Elena stayed behind, packing up her things at a leisurely pace. You were great in there, Elena said, glancing at Sophie. You really know how to lead. Sophie chuckled, a bit self-conscious. I'm still finding my footing. Don't sell yourself short, Elena replied. You've got the vision, and that's what matters most. The rest will come. Sophie nodded, appreciating the encouragement. Thanks, Elena. Once the room emptied, Sophie stayed behind, organizing her notes and reviewing the next steps. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Meeting with the angel investor confirmed for next Thursday. Be ready to wow him. She exhaled deeply, the excitement and nerves intertwining. The upcoming meeting was critical. Securing additional funding would allow her to scale the business, hire more staff, and develop the product faster. But it also meant facing someone who would scrutinize every detail of her plan, looking for weaknesses she hadn't anticipated. Determined not to leave anything to chance, Sophie spent the next few days refining her pitch. She practiced in front of the mirror, rehearsing answers to potential questions and anticipating objections. Late at night, when the city was quiet, she would sit by the window with a cup of tea, visualizing the future she wanted to create. She imagined Econist being installed in homes across the country, helping families save energy and live sustainably. She imagined seeing her company's name in headlines, not because of Richard's connections, but because of her own hard work. The night before the meeting, Julia came over with takeout and wine, knowing Sophie needed a distraction. They sat on the couch, the remains of their meal spread across the coffee table. Are you ready for tomorrow? Julia asked, sipping her wine. As ready as I'll ever be, Sophie replied, setting down her fork. I've gone over the pitch 100 times, but I'm still nervous. That's a good thing, Julia said. It means you care. Sophie smiled. I do. This isn't just a business venture for me. It's personal. I need this to work. It will, Julia said confidently. You've already come so far. As they talked, Sophie felt a sense of calm wash over her. She wasn't alone in this. She had a team, friends who believed in her, and a vision worth fighting for. Richard's doubts no longer held power over her. She was carving her own path, one step at a time. The next morning, Sophie arrived at the investor's office early, clutching her presentation folder tightly. The sleek, glass-walled building was intimidating, but she reminded herself that she belonged here. As she stepped into the elevator, she glanced at her reflection in the mirrored walls and saw a woman who was no longer defined by her past. She was ready to claim her future. When the elevator doors opened, Sophie took a deep breath and stepped into the waiting room, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for. As the receptionist called her name and led her toward the conference room, Sophie straightened her posture and lifted her chin. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't the same woman who had been humiliated at that dinner. She was stronger, smarter, and ready to take on the world. The soft hum of voices filled the sleek conference room as Sophie adjusted the collar of her blazer and smoothed her presentation folder on the polished wooden table. She could feel the weight of the investor's gaze on her as she stood at the head of the room, her heart racing with anticipation. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a breathtaking view of the Manhattan skyline. But Sophie's focus was fixed on the group of men and women seated in front of her. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the culmination of countless late nights and meticulous planning. Across the table sat David Liu, a prominent angel investor with a reputation for being both brutally honest and exceptionally strategic. His sharp eyes studied her with an intensity that made her palms sweat, but Sophie maintained her composure. This wasn't just another meeting. This was a chance to secure the funding that would catapult Econist from an ambitious startup to a major player in the tech world. Thank you for taking the time to meet with me, Sophie began, her voice steady despite the nerves swirling inside her. She clicked the remote, and the first slide of her presentation appeared on the large screen behind her. Econist, redefining smart, sustainable living. For the next 20 minutes, Sophie walked them through the intricacies of her business model, the unique features of the product, and the market potential. She spoke with conviction, weaving in personal anecdotes about her passion for sustainable living and the gap in the market that Econist was poised to fill. She highlighted the competitive advantages, the technological innovations, and the revenue projections, leaving no room for doubt about the viability of her vision. When she finished, the room fell silent for a moment before David leaned forward, tapping his pen against the table. Impressive presentation, he said, his tone neutral. But I have questions. Sophie nodded, prepared for the scrutiny. Of course. David glanced at her financial projections. Your growth projections are ambitious. How do you plan to achieve them without overextending your resources? Sophie took a breath, steadying herself. We're starting with a phased rollout, she explained, clicking to the next slide. Phase 1 targets early adopters and environmentally conscious homeowners in metropolitan areas. By focusing on a niche market initially, we can refine the product and establish a strong customer base before scaling up. We'll use the data from the first phase to optimize our operations and expand into larger markets. David nodded, seemingly satisfied with her response. And what about competition? There are already several smart home systems on the market. How do you differentiate yourself? Our system is more than just a smart home hub, Sophie said, her confidence growing. It's an adaptive, learning-based system that integrates with existing devices while optimizing energy consumption in real time. Competitors focus on individual smart devices, but Econist offers a holistic solution. Additionally, our AI continuously improves based on user behavior and seasonal changes, making it uniquely efficient. The questions continued, ranging from supply chain logistics to marketing strategies. Sophie answered each one with clarity and precision, drawing on her extensive preparation. By the end of the session, she could sense a shift in the room. The skepticism that had initially filled the air had given way to curiosity and respect. David leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen one last time before setting it down. "You've clearly done your homework," he said. "I'm impressed with your vision and your understanding of the market. I'm willing to provide the funding you're asking for, with the condition that we bring in a strategic advisor to help guide the initial rollout." Relief washed over Sophie, but she kept her emotions in check. "I'd be open to that," she said, extending her hand across the table. David shook it firmly, sealing the deal. As she left the building, Sophie stepped out onto the bustling street, the noise of the city wrapping around her like a familiar embrace. She had done it. The deal was secured, and Econist was one step closer to becoming a reality. She allowed herself a moment of celebration, standing on the sidewalk with a grin spreading across her face as she texted Marcus the news. "We're funded." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. With the funding secured, Sophie and her team worked tirelessly to finalize the product design and prepare for the launch of the first phase. The office, which had once been quiet and sparsely furnished, was now a hive of activity. Whiteboards were covered with notes and diagrams, prototypes were being tested, and the energy in the room was electric. One evening, as the team gathered around the conference table to review the latest product updates, Marcus walked in with a stack of newspapers and magazines. He tossed them onto the table, grinning. "We're making waves," he said, pointing to the headlines. Sophie picked up a copy of a tech magazine featuring an article titled "The Woman Behind the Next Big Thing in Smart Living." Her face stared back at her from the glossy page, and for a moment, she felt a strange mix of pride and disbelief. She had spent so long being defined by her relationship with Richard that seeing herself recognized for her own achievements felt surreal. "Look at this one," Priya said, holding up another article. "They're calling you the rising star of sustainable tech." Sophie laughed, shaking her head. "Let's hope the product lives up to the hype." "It will," Jacob said confidently. "We're building something incredible." But despite the team's growing excitement, Sophie couldn't help but feel the weight of the pressure mounting. Success wasn't guaranteed, and the risk of failure loomed large. Late at night, after the office had emptied, she would sit alone at her desk, reviewing every detail of their plans, searching for potential weaknesses. She knew the stakes were high, not just for the company, but for her personally. Failure would be more than a financial setback. It would be a validation of every doubt Richard had ever cast on her. The opportunity to face those doubts came sooner than expected. At a charity gala held in the heart of the city, Sophie found herself once again navigating the world of high society. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and the chatter of wealthy donors. But this time, Sophie wasn't attending as Richard's wife. She was here as the CEO of Econist, a guest in her own right. As she moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations from acquaintances who had read about her recent success, she spotted Richard across the room. He was standing near the champagne fountain, laughing with a group of executives. Amber was on his arm, her red dress clinging to her like a second skin. Sophie felt a brief pang of bitterness, but she quickly pushed it aside. Tonight wasn't about him, it was about her. "Fancy seeing you here," a familiar voice said. Sophie turned to see Marcus, holding 2 glasses of champagne. He handed one to her with a smirk. "You're making quite the impression." "I'm trying," she replied, taking a sip of the champagne. "You're doing more than trying," Marcus said. "People are starting to see you for who you really are." Sophie smiled, but before she could respond, Richard approached them, his gaze cool and calculating. "Sophie," he said, his tone polite but distant. "It's been a while." "Yes, it has," she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I hear you've been busy," he said, his eyes flicking to Marcus. "Starting a company, making headlines. Quite the transformation." "It's not a transformation," Sophie said calmly. "It's who I've always been." Richard smirked, as if her success was an amusing anomaly. "Well, good luck. Let's see if you can keep up." Sophie watched him walk away, the weight of his condescension settling on her shoulders for only a moment before she brushed it off. She had nothing to prove to him. Her success wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming her life. As the night went on, Sophie mingled with investors and industry leaders, securing new partnerships and expanding her network. By the time she left the gala, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The tides were shifting, and for the first time, she wasn't swimming against them. She was riding the wave. The hum of activity in the office had reached a fever pitch. Sophie stood in the center of it all, her phone pressed to her ear as she paced between desks, giving instructions while scanning the notes on her clipboard. The buzz of conversations, the clatter of keyboards, and the soft whir of the coffee machine filled the room with a sense of urgency that was both exhilarating and exhausting. They were days away from finalizing a partnership deal that could change everything. A deal that would put Econist at the forefront of the smart home revolution. "Keep the design team on standby," she said into the phone, her voice calm despite the chaos around her. "We might need to adjust the interface depending on the feedback from the focus group. I want their changes ready to implement by tomorrow." She ended the call and exhaled, glancing around the room. Marcus was huddled with Priya near the whiteboard, discussing the latest software update. Jacob was sketching revisions for the product's control panel, and Elena was on another call, likely negotiating with a media outlet for the upcoming product launch. Sophie felt a swell of pride. This was her team, driven, talented, and committed to making Econist a success. But the excitement was tempered by the pressure of the deal they were chasing. The contract they were negotiating was with Green Tech Solutions, a massive conglomerate with the resources to scale Econist's product nationwide. If the deal went through, it would solidify Sophie's position in the tech industry, but there was one obstacle she hadn't anticipated. Green Tech's supply chain relied heavily on a smaller startup that, as of last week, had been acquired by none other than Richard Chambers. Sophie had discovered this detail by accident while reviewing the due diligence report Marcus had compiled. The name of the company, ClearGrid Solutions, had caught her eye, not because she recognized it, but because of what it represented. ClearGrid controlled the distribution of a key component Econist needed to function seamlessly. If Richard decided to cut them off, the entire deal with Green Tech could fall apart. She hadn't told Marcus or the rest of the team yet. The idea of Richard interfering in her business was a bitter pill to swallow, but she wasn't ready to panic. Not yet. Later that evening, Sophie sat in her dimly lit office, the glow of her laptop casting shadows across the walls. She stared at the email draft she had been working on for over an hour, unsure of how to phrase her request without sounding desperate. Asking Green Tech for a backup supplier could raise red flags and jeopardize their trust. But leaving the issue unaddressed could be just as risky. Her phone buzzed, and she saw Julia's name flashing on the screen. She answered, grateful for the distraction. "Hey," Julia said, her voice warm and familiar. "How's the queen of sustainable tech holding up?" Sophie laughed softly. "Barely. We're in the middle of negotiating a huge deal, and I just found out that Richard owns the company controlling a critical part of our supply chain." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's complicated," Julia said carefully. "Does he know?" "I don't think so," Sophie replied. "But it's only a matter of time before he finds out. What are you going to do?" Sophie leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. "I don't know yet. I can't let him sabotage this deal, but I also can't afford to be reckless." "Well," Julia said thoughtfully, "maybe you don't need to play defense. Maybe it's time to go on the offensive." Sophie sat up, her mind racing. Julia was right. She had been so focused on protecting what she had built that she hadn't considered the possibility of taking control of the situation. If Richard thought he had the upper hand, she needed to prove him wrong. "I think I have an idea," Sophie said, a spark of determination igniting within her. The next day, Sophie called an emergency meeting with Marcus and Elena, revealing the situation with ClearGrid Solutions. "We have two options," she explained, pacing the length of the conference room. "We can either find a new supplier and risk delays, or we can negotiate directly with Richard and secure our position." Marcus frowned. "Do you think he'll play fair?" Sophie hesitated before answering. "Probably not. But that's why we're not going to give him the chance to dictate the terms." Elena raised an eyebrow. "What's your plan?" Sophie walked to the whiteboard and picked up a marker. "We're going to acquire ClearGrid." The room fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. Marcus was the first to speak. "That's ambitious. Do we have the capital for that?" "We will," Sophie said confidently. I've been in contact with a secondary investor who's interested in backing us if we can prove the strategic value of the acquisition. If we can convince GreenTech that owning ClearGrid strengthens our deal, they'll help secure the funding. Elena leaned back in her chair, a smile forming on her lips. I like it. It's bold. It has to be, Sophie replied. Richard won't see it coming. Over the next 2 weeks, Sophie and her team worked tirelessly to execute the plan. They analyzed ClearGrid's financials, identified its key assets, and built a proposal that showcased its value to both Econist and GreenTech. The negotiations were intense, with multiple late-night strategy sessions and back-and-forth discussions with investors. But Sophie was relentless, refusing to let fear or doubt slow her down. On the morning of the final negotiation, Sophie dressed in her sharpest suit, a tailored navy blazer and matching skirt that made her feel both powerful and composed. As she entered the boardroom where the meeting was being held, she was greeted by a familiar face. Richard. He was seated at the head of the table, his expression a mix of surprise and amusement. Sophie, he said, standing to shake her hand. I wasn't expecting to see you here. I'm full of surprises, she replied smoothly, taking a seat across from him. The meeting began, and Sophie presented her case with precision and confidence. She outlined the strategic benefits of the acquisition, emphasizing how it would streamline production and enhance Econist's scalability. Richard listened intently, his expression unreadable, but Sophie could sense the tension beneath his composed exterior. When she finished, Richard leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the table. You've done your homework, he said. But what makes you think I'll sell? Sophie met his gaze without flinching. Because you don't have a choice, she said calmly. ClearGrid is struggling financially, and you're not in a position to turn down a lucrative offer. If you hold on to it, you'll risk sinking money into a company that can't sustain itself. But if you sell, you walk away with a profit. Richard's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He knew she was right. The room fell silent as he considered her words. Finally, he nodded. Fine. You've got a deal. Sophie extended her hand, her heart pounding as they shook on it. The power dynamic between them had shifted, and for the first time, she was the one in control. Later that evening, as Sophie sat in her office reviewing the final paperwork, Marcus walked in with a bottle of champagne. You did it, he said, popping the cork and pouring them both a glass. Sophie smiled, the weight of the past few weeks finally lifting. We did it. As they clinked glasses, she felt a sense of triumph unlike anything she had ever experienced. Richard had underestimated her, but that was his mistake. She had proven to herself, and to the world, that she was capable of more than anyone had ever given her credit for. This wasn't just a victory for her business. It was a victory for the woman she had fought to become. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the crisp, morning air as Sophie stepped onto the balcony of her apartment. The city sprawled out before her, its relentless hum muted by the glass railing separating her from the bustling world below. With her hands wrapped around a steaming mug, she allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. The past few months had been a whirlwind of negotiations, late nights, and high-stakes decisions. But this morning felt different. For the first time, she wasn't chasing success. It was chasing her. Behind her, the sliding glass door opened, and Marcus stepped out, carrying a folder thick with contracts and meeting notes. He wore his usual casual button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and an easygoing expression that didn't quite mask the excitement in his eyes. Morning, he said, setting the folder on the outdoor table. Hope you're ready. Today's a big one. Sophie smiled, taking a sip of her coffee. I'm as ready as I'll ever be. Good, because once we sign that distribution deal, there's no turning back, Marcus said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. This is it, Sophie. The deal that solidifies Econist as a major player. She nodded, but a part of her couldn't help but think about how far she had come. Just months ago, she had been trapped in a life defined by Richard's success, her ambitions buried under layers of self-doubt. Now, she was on the verge of closing a deal that would make her company indispensable to the tech world, and, indirectly, to Richard's business empire. How's Richard taking it? Marcus asked, as if reading her thoughts. Sophie chuckled softly, setting her mug down. Not well. He tried to renegotiate the terms last night, but I held firm. He knows he's backed into a corner. Without us, his supply chain collapses. Marcus grinned, leaning back in his chair. Must feel good. It does, Sophie admitted, though she knew her victory wasn't just about beating Richard. It was about proving to herself that she was capable, resilient, and worthy of success on her own terms. The meeting was scheduled for noon in a sleek conference room on the 32nd floor of a downtown high-rise. Sophie arrived early, her navy blazer perfectly tailored, and her heels clicking confidently against the marble floor. Marcus walked beside her, holding a leather-bound portfolio containing the final contract. As they entered the room, Sophie's eyes immediately locked on Richard, who stood by the window, his back turned to her as he gazed out at the city. He looked as polished as ever, his custom-tailored suit impeccable and his posture commanding. But there was something different about him today. A tension in his shoulders, a stiffness in his stance that betrayed his frustration. He turned when he heard the door close, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. "Sophie," he said, nodding in acknowledgement. "Marcus." Sophie returned the nod, setting her portfolio on the table. "Let's get started." The legal teams from both sides took their seats, and the air in the room grew thick with formality. As the lawyers reviewed the final terms, Sophie kept her focus on the task at hand, but she could feel Richard's gaze flicker toward her every so often. He was studying her, probably trying to figure out how the woman he had once dismissed as not cut out for the real world had managed to outmaneuver him. An hour later, the lead attorney cleared his throat. "Everything seems to be in order. If both parties agree, we can proceed with the signing." Sophie picked up her pen, her fingers steady as she signed her name on the dotted line. When she handed the pen to Richard, their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the weight of their history hung between them. But Sophie didn't flinch. She had spent years living under his shadow, but today, she was casting her own. Richard signed the document and slid it back across the table. "Congratulations," he said, his voice measured. "You've built something impressive." "Thank you," Sophie replied, her tone equally composed. "It's just the beginning." As the lawyers gathered their papers and the meeting adjourned, Richard lingered behind, his gaze following Sophie as she packed up her things. When the room emptied, he cleared his throat, drawing her attention. "Sophie," he said, his voice softer than it had been moments ago. "Can we talk for a minute?" She hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her. "What is it?" Richard stuffed his hands into his pockets, a rare display of vulnerability. "I underestimated you," he admitted. "I didn't think you had it in you to do all this." Sophie crossed her arms, leaning slightly against the conference table. "Because you never took the time to see who I really am." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "You're right. I was too focused on myself, and I let that blind me to what you were capable of. I see it now." A flicker of the old pain stirred within her, but it was quickly overshadowed by the pride she felt in her accomplishments. "It's too late, Richard," she said gently but firmly. "I don't need your validation anymore." "I know," he said, a hint of regret in his voice. "But for what it's worth, I'm proud of you." Sophie studied him for a moment, searching for any signs of insincerity, but there were none. His words were genuine, and for the first time, she saw Richard not as her adversary, but as a man grappling with the consequences of his choices. She nodded, accepting his words without letting them define her. "Goodbye, Richard," she said, picking up her portfolio and heading toward the door. As she walked away, she felt an overwhelming sense of closure. The chapter of her life that had been defined by him was officially over. That evening, Sophie hosted a small celebration at her apartment. The team gathered around the dining table, toasting with champagne as laughter and stories filled the room. Julia was there too, beaming with pride as she clinked glasses with Marcus. "To Sophie," Marcus said, raising his glass. "The woman who proved that success is the best revenge." The room erupted in cheers, but Sophie shook her head, smiling. "This wasn't about revenge," she said, her voice steady. "It was about finding myself again." Julia wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "And you did. But don't let that stop you from enjoying this moment." Sophie laughed, taking a sip of her champagne as she watched her friends and colleagues celebrate. She had built more than just a business. She had built a life that was entirely her own, filled with people who believed in her and a purpose that went beyond proving anyone wrong. As the night wore on and the guests trickled out, Sophie stepped out onto the balcony, the cool night air brushing against her skin. She stared out at the city, the lights twinkling like stars, and allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had faced betrayal, humiliation, and doubt, but she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. The journey had been difficult, but it had led her here, to a place where she could stand tall, knowing that her success wasn't defined by anyone but herself. Her phone buzzed with a message from GreenTech's CEO. Looking forward to seeing what Econist achieves next. Sophie smiled, her fingers hovering over the screen before she typed her response. This is just the beginning. And she meant it. The stage lights bathed Sophie in a warm, golden glow as she stood behind the podium, her gaze sweeping across the massive conference hall. Rows upon rows of seats stretched out before her, filled with executives, industry leaders, and journalists from around the world. The hum of anticipation was palpable, and Sophie could feel its weight pressing against her chest. But unlike the nerves she had battled in the past, this was a different sensation, one of exhilaration and triumph. The keynote presentation at the Global Tech Summit was one of the most prestigious platforms in the industry, and Sophie had been invited to deliver the opening speech. It was an honor she had once dreamed of but never imagined achieving, especially after years of living in the shadow of someone else's success. But this time, she wasn't standing on this stage because of anyone else. She had earned this moment through hard work, resilience, and unwavering determination. Behind her, the massive screen displayed Econist's logo, clean, simple, and unmistakably bold. The words beneath it read, "Sustainable Living, Reimagined." Sophie smiled, taking a deep breath as she adjusted the microphone. The applause gradually faded, and the room fell silent, waiting for her to begin. "When I first imagined what Econist could be," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I was sitting in a small apartment with a notebook full of ideas and a head full of doubts. I wasn't sure if anyone would believe in my vision, and I certainly didn't expect that one day I'd be standing here, sharing it with all of you." She paused, scanning the faces in the audience. Some nodded in encouragement, others leaned forward in their seats, eager to hear more. "But what I've learned," she continued, "is that the most powerful thing you can do is believe in yourself, even when others don't. Because belief fuels action, and action creates change." The screen behind her shifted, displaying images of Econist's product in action. Families using the system to reduce their energy consumption, children learning about sustainable living, and communities benefiting from cleaner, greener homes. The images weren't just marketing material, they were proof of what her team had accomplished. "We live in a world where convenience and sustainability are often seen as opposing forces," Sophie said, her passion evident in her voice. "But Econist is here to change that. Our mission is to make sustainable living not only accessible but desirable. Because the future of our planet depends on the choices we make today." The audience erupted in applause, and Sophie took a moment to collect herself, her heart swelling with pride. She had rehearsed this speech countless times, but standing here, delivering it to an audience that genuinely believed in her vision, was a surreal experience. As the presentation continued, she highlighted the key milestones Econist had achieved: partnerships with major tech companies, glowing reviews from early adopters, and plans for international expansion. But she didn't shy away from discussing the challenges they had faced, either. Transparency, she had learned, was crucial to building trust, not just with investors, but with the people who used their product. "We've faced obstacles," she admitted. "There were moments when we weren't sure if we'd make it. But every challenge was an opportunity to learn and grow. And today, I'm proud to say that Econist isn't just a company, it's a movement." The final slide appeared on the screen. "Together, we build a better future." The applause was thunderous, and as Sophie stepped away from the podium, she felt a rush of emotions: pride, relief, and an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. This was more than a professional victory. It was personal. She had proven to herself that she was capable of creating something meaningful, something that could outlive the doubts and betrayals of the past. After the presentation, Sophie mingled with attendees at the networking reception, accepting congratulations and discussing potential collaborations. The energy in the room was contagious, and for once, she allowed herself to bask in it without second-guessing her worthiness. As she sipped her champagne, she spotted a familiar figure standing near the edge of the room, partially obscured by the crowd. It was Richard. He hadn't been invited, at least not by her. But given his connections in the industry, it wasn't surprising that he had managed to gain access. He was dressed impeccably, as always, but there was a distinct difference in his demeanor. The arrogance that had once defined him had been replaced by something more subdued, perhaps even regretful. Richard approached her slowly, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Sophie," he said, his voice softer than she remembered. "I saw your presentation. It was incredible." "Thank you," she replied, her tone polite but guarded. She wasn't sure what he wanted, but she was no longer the woman who sought his approval. He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I wanted to say that I'm proud of you." Sophie tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Why now, Richard? Why not when I needed it most?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because I was too blind to see what was right in front of me. I was selfish, and I didn't appreciate what you were capable of. I see it now, and I'm sorry." For a brief moment, the weight of their shared history pressed down on her. She thought of the nights she had spent waiting for him to come home, the humiliation she had endured at that business dinner, and the cruel words he had spoken about her capabilities. But she also thought of the strength she had found in those moments, the fire that had driven her to rebuild her life from the ground up. "I appreciate the apology," Sophie said, her voice gentle but firm. "But I don't need it to move forward." Richard nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I know, and that's what makes you so remarkable." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Sophie standing alone with her thoughts. She didn't feel vindicated or triumphant. She felt free, free from the weight of the past, from the need to prove herself to anyone but herself. Later that night, Sophie returned to her apartment, kicking off her heels and collapsing onto the couch. The city lights twinkled outside the window, casting a soft glow across the room. She reached for her phone and saw a text from Marcus. "Congrats, boss. Let's celebrate properly when you're back." She smiled, typing a quick response before setting the phone aside. As she leaned back, her eyes drifted to the bookshelf where her navy blue notebook sat neatly tucked between two volumes. The notebook that had once held her dreams and doubts was now a symbol of how far she had come. Her success wasn't just measured in numbers or accolades. It was in the quiet moments like this when she could sit back, reflect, and know that she had built a life that was entirely her own. As she closed her eyes, a sense of peace washed over her. This was just the beginning of her journey, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. She had faced failure, betrayal, and doubt, and she had emerged stronger. Whatever challenges came next, she knew she could handle them. Because this time, she wasn't building someone else's dream. She was living her own.